Liminal Occupation: Reflections on the Research Process. This piece opens up with a quote from Linda Twiwai Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies, Research in Indigenous Peoples. She says, "If I have one consistent message for the students I teach and the researchers I train, it is that Indigenous research is a humble and humbling activity." As I sit to write this piece, the city of Chicago reels in the immediate aftermath of the Democratic National Convention, or DNC. 4 days of spectacle where words ring loud and clear for everyone in the United Center to hear, creating a ripple effect through the news coverage so that even those who were not in attendance hear what was said. Contrast this with 4 days of protest and mass organized attempts to hold the speakers accountable for colonialism and genocide in Gaza, which received considerably less coverage by mainstream media outlets. Their voices have been so hard to hear, even as they gather en masse over the blare of the United Center speakers. I have been quite moved by the organizing and protest taking place here in Chicago, which proves that people are paying attention and will no longer be complacent in the use of U.S. resources to support occupation and oppression. The overwhelming feelings I am left with as a result of witnessing this contrast from the comfort of my home are guilt and shame. Guilty of complicity in the occupation in many ways over the course of my lifetime, of course, but guilty mostly for not participating in the marches and protests. Many feminists have critiqued the role of marches within accountability and advocacy work as the most performative act one can participate in, what Audre Lorde refers to as pornographic in her famous piece, Uses of the Erotic as Power. It thus involves the highest levels of ego and potential reward for participating, mainly in the form of public recognition. I am inclined to agree with these critiques and have pressured myself and my peers to diversify our strategies for activism, noting that it can take place in many ways, at any place, and at any time. I'm reminded of a conflict in the Office of Ethnic Studies during my undergraduate studies at Colorado State University over the quotes displayed in the office windows for passersby to read. We were thrown into debate when the chair of the department took down a quote displayed by students, replacing it with another that many felt did not reflect our political values. One faculty member insisted that the work, as it is sometimes called, does not happen in 25 characters. It happens in the classrooms. Dr. Caridad Souza clapped back. Of course the work happens in the classroom, but it can also happen in 25 characters. It can happen in 3 characters if I need it to. She was so formidable. Similarly, the marches outside of the DNC have mobilized a full range of characters, slogans, statistics, and songs to do their work. Their power lies in the persistence of their collective struggle. The march or protest becomes a site wherein people doing the work in all sorts of different ways, in different places, and at different times, come together and share joy and outrage. Indeed, I am guilty of staying home where it is comfortable and quiet, of neglecting to engage healthy and effective coping strategies for social anxiety, which also surfaces anytime I might be challenged to speak with strangers, and of not taking full advantage of avenues for activism I do have at my disposal throughout the past 10 months. So I am moved by the last 5 days of organizing to begin the work again. Thus, I return to this Substack page to continue my writing on settler colonialism and decolonization. Thus far, my work has not focused specifically on Israel as a settler state or on the experiences of Palestinians as an indigenous people. But I see in theorizing settler colonialism in the U.S., seeking to better understand my own social location therein, and building communities and commitment to movement for decolonization here, as immediately informed or immediately informing my understanding and response to occupation and genocide of Palestinians in Gaza or otherwise. Writing as an American living and teaching in Canada, Scott Morganson argues, indeed, the normalization of Israel as a Jewish state throughout the late 20th century, despite the UN recognition of Palestinians as a displaced people, demonstrates how readily settler colonialism can become naturalized. This also results if states defending Israel, such as Canada and the US, frame Israel as permanent because doing so, or to do so, insulates their own past and present settler colonial formation from question. Yet I submit that Israeli settler colonialism will be undone only if we are willing to consider the undoing of Canadian and US settler colonialism, and in turn, learning how to displace the Israeli settler subject may teach us how to more effectively displace Canadian and US settlers as well. I am moved in this historical moment to return to the work of exploring settler colonialism as well as other structures of oppression in social work and beyond in order to sharpen a critique of Israeli settler colonialism and my relationship to it as a U.S. settler citizen. In fact, over the past several months, I have developed an undergraduate course which seeks to do just this in the context of global queer politics. The class, tentatively titled Globally Queer Settler Homonationalism and Transnational Solidarity, will hopefully be offered in the spring quarter at DePaul University. I am considering sharing that syllabus here on Substack as simply another resource to be used for garnering ideas and inspiring a comparative analysis and critique, and to invite you all to provide constructive feedback. Stay tuned. Today, I return to the work by reflecting on the research process over a year and a half after the thesis Unsettling Graduate Social Work Education at DePaul University was completed. I have needed time to recover from the overwhelming time and energy needed to complete the thesis, as well as to revisit the work by sharing it here. In these reflections, I respond to charges put forward by Kumkum Bhavnani in her piece Tracing the Contours, Feminist Research and Feminist Objectivity, to reveal the potential help and harm I may have done in the process of researching these critical topics. Tracing the Contours. Theorists of feminist standpoint argue that there is not necessarily a distinguishable feminist method. Rather, it is the ways in which researchers deploy their methods which is of high concern. Feminist researchers can engage in research on any given topic using any given method, but are charged to actively reflect on their relationship to the topic, subjects, methods, and so on. Donna Haraway writes about the God trick in her piece Situated Knowledges, the Science Question in Feminism in the Privilege of Partial Perspective, wherein researchers position themselves as objective observers, devoid of biases or motivations beyond the furthering of capital S science. This results in a belief that researchers are somehow godly in their ability to be impartial and ever present, yet never socially, politically, or emotionally involved. In mainstream science, this is considered good as it supposedly removes any factors that may skew the data toward a particular conclusion. Their findings are simply observable facts, or so we are led to believe. By grappling explicitly with our own perspectives on a particular topic, subject pool, or method, feminist researchers situate themselves in relation to their work and assist their readers in situating their work in a broader discourse. It is clear that what their interests, motivations, passions, and goals are, displacing a desire to generalize their findings as observable facts and challenging the very notion of objectivity. This results in what we might call feminist objectivity and feminist methodologies. Similarly, the Maori scholar Linda Twiwai Smith states in her groundbreaking work, Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples, that, quote, decolonization is a process which engages with imperialism and colonialism at multiple levels. For researchers, one of those levels is concerned with having a more critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values which inform research practices. Building on Haraway, Bhavnani outlines 3 charges of feminist objectivity, which I use to evaluate my own work on unsettling graduate social work education at DePaul University. In doing so, I also integrate Indigenous voices, such as Smith's, to flesh out my relation to the Native peoples about whom I ventured to theorize with this project. Representations reinscribing inequality. The first charge is the analyses cannot be complicit in dominant representations which reinscribe inequality. Haraway and Bhavnani are speaking specifically about research that involves women as their subjects, thus insisting that the researcher should not only be accountable to the individual subjects, but also to the project of feminisms to liberate women as a broader population from patriarchal rule. My thesis did not narrow the subject pool to women. In fact, there were no gendered eligibility requirements. That said, my research has still been accountable to the projects of feminisms, specifically with regard to tying settler colonialism to heteropatriarchy. In the theoretical framework section of the introduction, I synthesized literature on the relationship that settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy share. Drawing on works by Native feminist theorists, I briefly discussed how gender has been mobilized through the refusal to recognize the political power of women in Native nations and curtail people of many genders' ability to own property under settler state law, in turn limiting their ability to accumulate wealth. Let me add here the imposition of Christianity through couple centric marriage contracts and the nuclear family model to supplant the power of quote unquote queer people in Native societies, and sexual abuse of individuals and of the land. Today, of course, we continue to see the coloniality of gender play out in the subordination of queerness, especially in communities of color, who are ironically always already doing gender wrong from the perspective of settlers. Compensatory gender performances, particularly on the part of men of color, the dogma of identity categorization and ownership, in the insistence that Israel is a safe place for gays and lesbians as an implicit justification for their active genocide of Palestinians, and the U.S.'s persistent dedication to supporting that genocide. With regard to our unsettling graduate social work education at DePaul University, the representations which may reinscribe inequalities that are of main concern are those of Native peoples. Natives are directly implicated in my work, as settler colonialism is all about eliminating natives. And conversely, decolonization is about land and life back to natives. I am a non native who came to Native feminist theories and to this project through women of color feminisms, and thus attempted to ground myself in feminist approaches for working across differences when conducting research impacting peoples to which I do not belong. This approach may have been sufficient in my interactions with the participants in my study, as they were a multiracial group of non natives. Yet, Indigenous scholarship regarding peoplehood, kinship, sovereignty, and research are necessary in this context because Indigenous peoples are peoples, not simply populations. So, feminist scholarship on race, class, gender, and sexuality differences on its own is insufficient for understanding work in this regard. As Linda Twywai Smith points out, the literature uses the word populations rather than peoples, and there is a distinction in international law between these two terms. As a marginalized population, Maori are basically just another group or set of individuals and communities. As peoples, Maori have claims to self determination. There is a risk in framing or fragmenting small groups of Maori into categories of marginalization and vulnerability, of losing sight of the overall picture of Maori as an indigenous and marginalized people in New Zealand. In the context of social work, working with peoples as opposed to populations means understanding how peoples are politically designated and the different treaty responsibilities that the U.S. federal government fulfills or neglects with those peoples. For example, in Chicago, there is one Indian Health Service site where enrolled members of tribes or individuals who belong to a people can receive primary care at a different rate than if they were to seek services at a general population healthcare provider. This also means building an understanding of tribal sovereignty then. After all, the Council on Social Work Education added tribal sovereign status to the educational policies and accreditation standards, and not tribal or native identity. Sovereignty was just briefly touched on in my thesis, so I will add a little bit of depth here. The basis of sovereignty is found in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 and has been deployed by Western states to distinguish one polity, including its subjects and territories, from another. In other words, it is a recognition of a nation's existence and right to rule. As mentioned in the thesis, Kalt and Singer succinctly define sovereignty as self-rule, with the recognition that its source, state, and consequences may not be so simply understood. Lorenzo Veracini has written that for settler nations, sovereignty is understood to be inherent and travels with them, whereas indigenous peoples' sovereignty is perpetually contested. Yet it is always settler nations, operating under the framework of Western nation to nation relations, and often backed by a coalition of Western and often other settler states, who have the power to recognize the sovereignty of others. Thus, Mark Rifkin names sovereignty as a translation, referring less to something that indigenous peoples simply have, preceding and outside the terms of settler occupation, than to the uneven and fraught dynamics by which the settler state recognizes/disavows indigenous modes of peoplehood, and indigenous peoples negotiate the shifting imperatives/contingencies of settler rule. Finally, Andrea Smith argues that the road tribes take in navigating the terrain of sovereignty is simply a means to delay the genocide and ultimate elimination of Native peoples. For her, efforts should be less focused on seeking and maintaining recognition from the settler state and more on paving the way toward an otherwise world. So, sovereignty is both an avenue through which to understand the nation to nation relationship tribes have with the U.S., as well as the situatedness of individual natives as citizens of both their tribal nations and the U.S. It can be as simple as knowing when someone can access IHS services, or as complicated as seeing the array of policy challenges, such as that against ICWA, which was described thoroughly in the thesis, as a threat to tribal self-determination. I will leave it to you all, whom I assume are mostly social workers, to break down in more detail how each is co-constructed at the macro, meso, and micro levels for yourselves. In addition to addressing Native peoples as peoples with sovereign rights to self-rule and supposed protections under international law, it is important also not to reinscribe common perceptions of Native peoples in the settler colonial imaginary, which also reinscribe inequalities. Linda Twywise Smith reminds us that historically, individuals who interacted with indigenous peoples, either as travelers and adventurers, anthropologists, or social workers, quote, represented the capital O, other, to a general audience back in Europe, which became fixed in the milieu of cultural ideas. Images of the cannibal chief, the red Indian, the witch doctor, or the tattooed and shrunken head, and stories which told of savagery and primitivism generated further interest and therefore further opportunities to represent the other again. In other words, research on natives has been quick to portray them as culturally static, exotic, and or backwards, constructing an image of a queer racialized other which captures the imaginations of settlers who themselves filter the information through an already skewed understanding of natives as savage and primitive. In turn, settlers are greatly interested in learning more, in funding new research projects that pursue topics which they find fascinating. This dynamic has changed very little in the contemporary US. Non natives, especially those who make false or tenuous claims to native quote unquote identity and belonging, become the representatives of actual native people's interests and leaders of initiatives and programs with sometimes devastating impacts. Let me provide two examples. Firstly is Andrea Smith, whom I cited above and is cited multiple times in the thesis. As with many in the field of Native/Indigenous studies, I find it hard to avoid Andrea Smith's work and am riddled with conflicted feelings when it comes to integrating her analyses into my work. Smith is a former faculty at the University of California, Riverside, author of the widely circulated book Conquest, Sexual Violence, and American Indian Genocide, co-founder of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, and contributor to numerous scholarly journals and anthologies. She is notorious for lying about her ties to the Cherokee Nation and then going remote silent when called to account. Those who have attempted to call her into community and repair the harm that she caused often emphasize that while her theorizing may be sound in many ways, she has represented herself in a particular way to manipulate those around her into sharing personal and often painful stories, collaborating with her, and uplifting her voice. Since I have not yet found a way to avoid citing her work entirely, I have made an effort to share the following resources in order to help my readers and my colleagues to better identify her standpoint. And I list here three articles, and each is also a link to where you can read the article. The first is The Native Scholar Who Wasn't by Sarah Viren, published by the New York Times. Also, Open Letter from Indigenous Women Scholars Regarding Discussions of Andrea Smith by Joanne Barker and others, published in Indian Country Today. And finally, Playing Indian Constitutes a Structural Form of Colonial Theft and It Must Be Tackled by Kim Tallbear, published here on Substack. The second example is me. I mentioned in the thesis that there were tragically few Native students in the MSW program at DePaul and no known faculty or staff. As the singular voice bringing attention to the topics of settler colonialism, decolonization, and Native peoples, I have been perceived as speaking with authority on these matters. I have been called upon in class to define settler colonialism and to speak to its relevance on course topics, and in faculty meetings to present my findings and make recommendations for redress. Since graduating, I've been brought in as an internal consultant for a committee developing a land acknowledgement at one of the 7 city colleges of Chicago, using my thesis as a pretext and as evidence of my supposed expertise on the topic. I have been asked to return to DePaul for guest lectures in both the departments of social work and women's and gender studies about my research and Native feminist theories, respectively. Recently, I was tapped for another guest lecture on the topic and opted to support the Women's and Gender Studies Department and the Women's Center in bringing in Native leaders from the community for a panel discussion. I identified the organizations which I believe best aligned with the values of the department, mainly on the extent to which they address heteropatriarchy and anti-Blackness in their work, drafted outreach correspondence, and offered to waive my honorarium in order for the community partners to receive fair compensation. I certainly do not share this to pat myself on the back or further represent myself as a leader, but as a strategy that I have recently used to displace myself as a leader and recenter Native analyses and organizing. I will elaborate on how I attempted to do this in the thesis itself in the next section. Indeed, researching Native peoples in the academy can be a lucrative endeavor, creating multiple incentives to do so, as well as to represent oneself in a way that facilitates easy access to communities and to trust. For those of us who enter into this discourse, we must consistently remind ourselves that the settler colonial imagination sees native land, life, and knowledges as just more wealth to be possessed by the settler state. And researchers may very well be positioned as the quote unquote experts who can simultaneously mine the well of native wealth and facilitate its dissemination. Along similar lines, my research positioned the non native participants as experts on the experiences of settler colonialism personified in the social worker. Their perceptions of the extent to which settler colonialism, decolonization, and Native peoples were included in graduate social work education curricula provided the foundation upon which my critique was built. Yet in the thesis, I acknowledge that students are working in the community with a variety of community based organizations, which are led and operated by natives here in the city. While I would venture to guess that none of those organizations are on the Department of Social Work's list of community partners, a fact which I never looked into, one might logically conclude that Native organizers in the city have interacted with DePaul students. This begs the question, why did I not reach out to these potential partners for review of and feedback on my project, particularly at the beginning stages, but also throughout? Linda Toy Smith states that the process of consultation, collective meetings, open debate, and shared decision making are crucial aspects of tribal research practices. So, this project should have been accountable to natives here in what is currently Chicago. Given the fact that there were no native individuals in the department, I turned to a mentor whom I knew was knowledgeable on the topic and brought her onto my committee. Yet even she is not directly implicated in the results of this project, as urban natives here in Chicago have been. Conduct, write-up, and dissemination. Bhavnani's second charge is for the researcher to consider how and to what extent does the research conduct, write-up, and dissemination deal with the micropolitics of the research encounter. And what were the dynamics of domination and subordination negotiated by the researcher, and what means through which they were discussed in the write up? During my thesis defense, Ro Bubar stated that there was a, quote, liminal occupation performed by my work. At the time, I did not know what liminal meant, so I responded by stating that I would need to consider her question further before I could address it. This allowed me to dodge the question, and if it were not for my sitting down to write this piece, likely never have to answer it. In the time since it was asked, I have been able to look up the definition of liminal, and I will share it here for those of you who may also not have encountered this word before. A quick internet search will show that liminal refers to occupying a position at or on both sides of a boundary or threshold, or relating to a transitional or initial stage of a process. When she raised this concern, I believe she referred to the ways in which the project called the department in for not grappling with the strengths, needs, and desires of Native peoples in curricula, while simultaneously not having any Native individuals as researchers or participants. With this in mind, both definitions apply. I am simultaneously mortified by and thankful for this realization. I am also grateful for the opportunity to address it here. I wrote about much of what I believe Bubar hoped to draw my attention to in the previous section, and it is evident that I agree with her feedback. There was much about this research design that continued occupation. Yet, when faced with the initial stages of a process, as the second definition of liminal states, one must ask both why and how this process should unfold. My goal was to unsettle social work education in a department with no Native faculty or staff and very few Native students. How else might I go about doing this? This question gets at one's theory of change. Reflecting on Linda Twywai Smith's work in decolonizing methodologies, Eve Tuck writes, "My work on articulating repatriation could be read as an extended footnote on the decolonizing methodologies. It is concerned with these three questions. How do we think change happens? What role does research have in our theories of change? What role do academic researchers have in our theories of change? My worry is that much of research science, or much of social science research, operates from a colonial theory of change, in which the proof of neglect is displayed for the state in order to receive needed material gains. This theory of change is incompatible with notions of power and change that are part of indigenous ways of knowing, and also, I assert, rarely works. Without making how we think about or how we think change happens explicit, we may inadvertently rely on theories of change that locate power entirely outside of our communities, so that we use research to document damage to prove to someone outside that we are deserving of more, or rely on neoliberal narratives in which the only logic is a market logic. Reflecting on the project, I realized that the entire effort was meant as to demonstrate proof of neglect in order to receive needed gains, as Tuck critiques here. The theory of change from which I have operated was indeed a colonial theory. Feeling the pressure to demonstrate proof of neglect to the Department of Social Work, I was moved to embark on a project examining education on a particular topic, directly implicating particular peoples, even when there were none of those peoples involved. In other words, in other words, this colonial theory of change produced/produces research which is itself also colonial, and so on. Having been so critical of teaching settler colonialism as a structure, I had not fully turned the lens back onto myself to see the structural nature of the project I was leading. I feel it necessary to point out here that there was one Native student whom I spoke to about participating in the project. Ultimately, they did not take part in focus group discussion, and I was never informed as to the reasons why. I respect this person's decision and imagine that risk fatigue was a likely factor for them. It can be exhausting to be the only one in the room with first-hand knowledge of the lived experiences being discussed. And I do not blame any individual who is tired of taking on the responsibility of representing an entire group to others. Faced with the reality that either not I nor the participants were Native, I was challenged to make my individual and our collective standpoint clear to readers, as well as displacing our voices when appropriate. I did this in three main locations in the text: in the preface, the limitations, and the recommendations. In the preface, a brief note about the author, I sought to make my motivations for embarking on this work as clear as possible. Theorizing settler colonialism helped me to understand my own social location, my own standpoint, and led me to thinking more creatively about addressing social problems in coalition with others. I had already experienced the efficacy of theorizing settler colonialism and felt motivated to do so in the context of my education, as well as my quote-unquote identity. In revisiting the preface, I do not think I could have said more about this topic without becoming tangential. Perhaps I will flesh out the topic of my family history in a future piece. I do think I could have been more clear in naming my theory of change, research interests, and tracing the evolution of this project. Initially, I had wanted to interview other social work students of color and explore the extent to which paradigms of the field aligned or misaligned with the values of our families and communities of origin. There's still potential in that line of inquiry, so that may yet manifest in a full blown research project. I was interested in interrogating social work as a colonial force, but my theorizing about colonization was undisciplined. As I mentioned in the preface, I've confused colonizations and conflated subjectivities therein. That's when I reached out to an old professor of mine from Colorado State University, Ro Bubar, who helped provide some theoretical scaffolding. In turn, I was able to narrow in on settler colonialism as the focus. The second place where I attempted to account for these problematics was by naming the fact that no Native students participated as a limitation. I stated, "This study lacks reflections and experiences of Native students. None of the participants, nor I, as the primary researcher, identified as Native or were enrolled members of a tribe. As such, the research design and data are from a distinctly non-Native standpoint. Having Native students as participants and/or researchers likely would have added perspectives to the study that are easily lost or neglected by those of us who do not share those social positions, political designations, and lived experiences." While I think the absence of Native voices is easily grasped as a major limitation to the study by most folks in or out of academia, I want to continue to expand on this limitation to emphasize the extent to which this truly limits the nature, scope, and implications of this work. In her piece, Working Together Across Difference, Some Considerations on Emotions and Political Practice, feminist scholar Uma Narayan contests that privilege is a deficit, that it limits those of us who experience it in our ability to recognize, name, and combat structures which produce our privileges. Think how white people often become confused or disgruntled when whiteness or white privilege is named. Conversely, individuals who are oppressed experience epistemic privilege. Quote, "The claim of epistemic privilege amounts to claiming that members of an oppressed group have a more immediate, subtle, and critical knowledge about the nature of their oppression than people who are non-members of the oppressed group." Narayan further clarifies that members of oppressed groups may not know the causes of their oppression. For example, a Native person may experience crises with regard to their self concept and relationship to their tribe as a result of relocation policies, but may not realize that it is relocation that results in the stress they feel. Or they may know about relocation policies and the impacts it has on their felt sense of connection to their tribe, but not necessarily label that as a genocidal tactic employed by a settler state intent on eliminating Native peoples. To put it succinctly, members of oppressed groups understand what the day to day social, emotional, and material consequences are through a direct experience of their manifestation in their own lives. With regard to my study, participants lacked epistemic privilege as a result of not belonging to a tribe or living as natives in the department. They/we did not know what the daily experiences of a Native person in the program is like, and thus may be ignorant to attempts to teach about Native peoples and the structural or historical nature of their oppression, whether those attempts are successful or not. We also do not know the extent to which they experience microaggressions in curricula or in social interactions between students and with faculty. Bubar, Kelly, Bundy Fazioli, Sousa, and Lovato Romero impart the importance of theorizing microaggressions within a framework of settler colonialism because it, quote, "marks how social work's logics of conquest and settler complicity combine to sustain social work field and classroom experiences that wittingly or unwittingly condone violence against Indigenous people." And because microaggressions are often deployed by social workers to, quote, "reinforce land dispossession and seek to limit the future of Native nations." In other words, settler colonialism sorry, microaggressions are interpersonal behaviors that support the overall structure of settler colonialism and can be a major barrier to learning, even if curricula included robust lessons on the topic of settler colonialism. These dynamics in the Department of Social Work at DePaul University were almost completely missed as a result of the absence of Native individuals, and that was not addressed in the limitations. Lastly, with regard to the write up, I attempted to displace the voices of myself and the participants with voices of Native scholars from the literature review. Due to the reasons I have just explained, I did not always feel it was appropriate to use our voices to speak with authority on the matter at hand. I did this throughout the write up by citing my sources thoroughly, which is a best practice in academic writing anyway, and by integrating what I felt was a disproportionate amount of quotes. As I mentioned in the thesis, I wanted my readers to know that there exists a wealth of scholarship on settler colonialism, Native feminist theories, and Indigenous social work that informed the project and that they have access to in addition to my work. The most prominent example of this was in the recommendations, wherein I utilized recommendations from Arville Tuckin-Morill's piece on decolonizing women's and gender studies. I prefaced the framing of the recommendations with the following words, and having already thoroughly reflected on the problematics of Native voices, or lack thereof in my study, I do not feel the need to elaborate further here. There is no point in recreating the wheel in presenting what are essentially the same recommendations in a different order or with slightly different words. Furthermore, many of the recommendations identified from the literature review follow similar themes and are integrated herein. What follows is a synthesis of the challenges presented in decolonizing feminism, challenging connections between settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy, and other literature which I have simply put into the context of graduate social work education. As such, they are not necessarily mine, nor are they the students who participated in this study. None of us have sufficient knowledge, expertise, or authority to make recommendations. You will, however, read some student thoughts, including my own, where they echo the literature or add specificity to the circumstances at DePaul. Questions of difference. Bhavnani's third and final charge is to interrogate the extent to which questions of difference are dealt within the research study. My research was about Native peoples only indirectly. My primary subject of study was the Department of Social Work at DePaul University, a multiracial, albeit predominantly white, academic department. My participants were four enrolled, at the time, students in the department. I named in the limitations that students, myself included, are not only located in a set of settler colonial relations as social workers, but also as individuals who come from families and communities who are also located relationally. To use the social work jargon, settler colonialism situates us at macro, meso, and micro levels. How participants in the study were uniquely located in settler colonialism went unscrutinized, however. While I do believe that interrogating this question further would have been beyond the scope of the study itself, and a write up would have been read as tangential, it would have been irresponsible to neglect the question entirely. As I outlined in the thesis, structures of privilege and oppression set the stage in which individual actors come together and dialogue. This includes me and the participants of my study. That said, I felt I could not speak with specificity in this regard because participants themselves had limited awareness of their own situatedness in a set of settler colonial relations. I felt I could not position myself as an educator during the focus groups without greatly impacting the discussion. And doing so would have compromised the confidentiality promised to my participants and risked sharing identifying information about them, such as their race, ethnicity, gender, and so on. For this last reason primarily, I will not elaborate on this topic in more detail here. Be that as it may, I will highlight one way that I wrote about my attempts to address differences in the research encounter. That is through the use of a virtual talking piece. In the methodology section, I quickly outline the history of the talking piece, including its roots with different indigenous peoples, how it was used during focus groups, and that it served to reduce the hierarchy of voices, open up silence, and enhance connections with all of the parties involved, as was suggested by Clark and Yellowbird. I am satisfied with the deployment of the talking piece in this context, but feel the responsibility to trace the practice's genealogy and unsettle the use of indigenous practices in what are otherwise settler forms of relating. To that end, I plan to explore the text Colonizing Restorative Justice, Voicing Our Realities. And there's a link here in the text where you can purchase that book from the publisher. Indigenous Research Agenda. I opened this piece with a quote from Linda Twiwai-Smith stating that Indigenous research is a humble and humbling activity. Upon reflecting on the research process, I find that this is indeed the truth. Once again, I am made painfully aware of just how much more growing I still have to do. I felt so empowered, so enlightened when I finished Unsettling Graduate Social Work Education at DePaul University, and have ridden that high for a year and a half as I have continued to speak on related topics at DePaul and in my workplace. I was simultaneously unsettled and reinforced in my settler privilege by the project. Thus, Bubar's critique of the project as liminal occupation feels quite appropriate. The question then becomes, where do we/I go from here? For guidance in this regard, I and other social workers and researchers can turn to the Indigenous Research Agenda outlined by Linda Twiwai-Smith. In this agenda, Smith outlines the different components one might take on when engaging in research with, about, or as Indigenous peoples. With self-determination at the center, the framework ripples out to include development, recovery, and survival in that order as you progress further toward the outer circle. Smith elaborates, quote, "The tides represent movement, change, process, life, inward and outward flows of ideas, reflections, and actions. The four directions named here, decolonization, healing, transformation, and mobilization, represent processes. They are not goals or ends in themselves. They are processes which connect, inform, and clarify the tensions between the local, the regional, and the global. They are processes which can be incorporated into practices and methodologies." And at this point in the text, I have a picture which I took out of my personal copy of Decolonizing Methodologies of the research, the Indigenous Research Agenda. And as I described before, there's a sort of series of four circles which are sort of inside each other, creating an effect where at the center is self-determination, and it sort of appears to ripple out from there in a circular fashion or in a circular shape in all directions, going from self-determination in the next ripple to development and the next recovery and the next survival. And then at the very top, you have text that sort of cuts through each ripple that says healing. And underneath healing, it says physical, spiritual, psychological, social, collective restoration. And then on the right hand side, you have another text which cuts through each tide that says decolonization. And under that, political, social, spiritual, psychological. And again, on the bottom, it says transformation. Psychological, social, political, economic, collective change. And then on the left-hand side, the final box or text that cuts through each tide says mobilization, local, national, region, global. The Indigenous Research Agenda does not map perfectly onto a social work ecosystems theory framework, with each tide representing also the micro, meso, and macro levels. Rather, social workers can think of the entire Indigenous research agenda as playing out at each level. In other words, decolonization, healing, transformation, and mobilization can happen at individual, community, and or societal levels, deploying strategies for survival, recovery, development, and self-determination in a myriad of creative ways. As social workers, researchers, and individuals, we should be moved to unsettle social work, education and research, theory and practice, with Native peoples, Native scholars like Linda Twywai Smith, Tuck, Yellowbird, Boobar, and so many more guiding our way. These reflections have been a vital part of my own growth, but they are also instructions for others so as to not repeat the harms that I have. The field of social work needs to be learning, teaching, and researching settler colonialism, decolonization, and Native peoples. But it need not happen at further expense of those whom we seek to help. I give Smith the final instructive word for those of us seeking to be in better relation with Indigenous communities and with each other. Where we start, quote, might be as simple as focusing on building good relationships and showing one's face as the first step in a relationship. But they are also about building networks of people who have stronger links into communities and building community capacities so that people can do the research themselves. And here at the end of the text, of course, we have the list of footnotes, the citations. And I will include also links to some of those citations, particularly the books and online articles, so that you can access them directly here. As always, thank you so much for listening and or reading.